Hey guys, this is Mikro here. I wanted to make a video to talk about the New World League since we're seemingly at about the halfway point, maybe a little bit before the halfway point for the event in terms of league schedule, but in terms of timelines are about there. I wanted to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and kind of where New World League can kind of take this to in terms of improving things that have been lacked upon with the original kind of plans for the event. So first off, I want to talk about for the good of the event. The event in general is a really fun community driven event, and kind of it feels like similar like kind of smaller communities have been built overnight for the event itself. Everyone seems to be like pretty positive. Everyone is kind of playing and doing stuff together on these servers, and it feels like a lot of people are feeling more connected than they did to companies on the live servers, and generally are kind of inspiring people to work harder again from the PvP scene in the live servers instead of just slotting people who are slotted in other servers in wars, and instead are starting to look at VODs, do OPR nights, do 5v5s, and it feels like everyone is kind of getting the most out of that experience. There's no gear gap for the New World League, which has been really refreshing. It feels like there are some people that have played on the other servers have not had access to good gear because they do not have the gold to afford to get new gear, and that barrier being lifted has kind of made people realize that some players are actually a lot better than people thought, and then they were just mostly gear gapped on the other servers. Feels like a lot of people are being familiar with what is considered to be best in slot gear now too. Like there's stuff published in terms of guides, and you could like look at Twitch and see like what your favorite streamer is playing kind of thing. But it feels like generally more people are when they're playing the meta gear set, you could start seeing that some people are a lot better than people thought they were. They're relatively balanced rosters for this event rather than super companies, which is very refreshing. On basically every server in NA, and I believe on most servers in EU, there are only like one or two companies per server that are like at the top of the top competitive with each other, and then there's like kind of a lesser division of companies that are also competitive with each other, but there's a big tier gap between the two, and it feels like that tier gap isn't really present with this New World League event as much, which is very refreshing. OPRs are super clumpy, and they allow people to learn how to play the game better at a high level from like a war perspective, more so than live OPRs. On live OPRs, the queue times are much lower though, so due to that like kind of queue time being decreased, I'd say the popularity of live OPRs are generally a little bit more, but people are able to kind of work together and kind of do more group play stuff within these kind of community driven OPRs. There's also community-wide pushes, which kind of helps keep down on the push time. Wars are generally super fun. The new names are very refreshing. It's very different than other wars where there's some things that like you would think that everyone would know that you realize that people don't know, and it's like building people up and kind of eliminating that gap between newer players to war and more experienced players is very cool, and I hope that translates to the live game as well. It feels like the scene in New World League is a lot more diverse than the entirety of NA Wars at this point. Like, there's no alt problem. By that, I mean there are definitely people like in terms of like every server on NA from west to east to even EU. There are people from Dropouts and Supple that are slotted on like every roster, like a good 5 to 10 of them from like the top companies in each region, and it feels like that kind of barrier being lifted since I could only have one character that plays on one company on this has allowed newer people, newer faces to kind of get more involved and see what wars are like. It's also allowed people that were not playing the game for a while to come back to the game in a spot where they are can be consistently slotted, don't have to put in kind of the 100 to 250 hour like minimum like a time requirement to actually start getting involved in the war scene. So that's kind of been helpful too. Feels like that barrier to entry has been lessened to a degree, and that barrier to entry I think is one thing that's gatekeeping a lot of people from doing New World PvP content, because in order to get to the actual PvP content, you basically have to get to level 60. I wouldn't say you have to get to 625, but you definitely have to get to level 600. You need to get like 3 per gear, and then after that, and after like potentially you get your gear up to 625, you could start looking at doing PvP from an OPR perspective, you could start doing it once you get to 600 because of gear scaling, but you just need the 2 per gear pretty much. That's 600 to have like the the actual attribute combinations that you would need, but it's like generally you need there's a very big barrier to entry for the PvP scene, which makes sense, but the getting to that point where you could play on an account is very, very frustrating and time consuming, and I think most people do not like the grind that has to take place, along with like leveling the weapons for every single character on every single account. If you have multiple accounts, is very, very frustrating because each one of those weapons to get to level 20 takes about 4 hours, about maybe like 4 hours with the double XP, maybe two with double XP. It's like it's in that range, and it's just generally like a giant time sink that is not very fun to do from an optimized perspective. I think also a lot of members are being shown the leadership that is involved for top companies to do well, which I hope translates to other companies. But like the amount of like 5v5 nights, OPR nights that are going on, VOD reviews that are happening, it feels like people are involved with their own community in this event almost all day, every day at this point, which is a little bit degenerate, but it feels like a lot of people are getting stuff out of that. Like with the effort that they're putting in, they're definitely receiving that back from leadership, which is a little bit different than the live scene. Want to move on to the bad side of this event now. Pushes were originally supposed to be instant. The problem with them being instant is it turned out that one mission would complete a push, which meant that someone could sabotage the entire event. So that got reverted, that got put back to normal standing, but there's also a bug where some forts are getting locked and they literally cannot be flipped. Basically, how this has resulted is pushes are actually taking longer than they do on the live client, which is very, very frustrating because there's bugs from the previous patches that are getting reintroduced to this patches in terms of forts being capped. Like that was supposed to be fixed forever ago. That's not fixed now. So it's been resulting in pushes taking longer than normal, and that's generally an activity that kind of deteriorates the PvP scene because every time you want to war, you have to push, and every time you push, it's like a multi-hour long event of not having fun and running in circles just so you could have access to the 30 minutes of content that everyone wants to play in for this game. This war consumes have to be manually farmed. So this is like Desert Sunrise. Like people had to organize chest runs to get Desert Sunrise because that wasn't something that was provided. Uh, but there's like it's generally close to a sandbox environment, but there's some things that are missing, like the elemental resistance pots. That's something that's meta in the PvP perspective that is completely missing from the actual event. So people have had to like manually farm those, and those tend to take a long time. And even though on the live client, like I think people make fun of like people who well not make fun of, but there's people who like farm those, and those aren't present on this like kind of server as much, and it feels like it's kind of a chore to get access to most of those, as well as like bots, to be honest, are kind of nice in that regard because not everyone wants to run around and farming those reagents for hours upon hours. This name drops have to be manually farmed. This is like it's kind of fine, but there's some things that you just can't organize a group to actually get those drops, which are it's much easier to do on the live side. And there's definitely some items that are kind of necessary for certain builds to work because they're a name drop, and those items are generally pretty hard to get. I'd say OPR at this point is dead because of cross-world OPR. I think that's honestly a good thing for the live game, but the bad part about that is people can't really practice anymore once that cross-world OPR got released in an environment where they can kind of more so practice for war. The actual live environment is very skirmish heavy, which is great from like a kill squad perspective, I would say. Or not great, but it's like satisfactory from that perspective. But it's just the barrier from going to OPR and then becoming a war player is very, very, very high. And I don't think this helps it necessarily. The live OPRs are much faster than queues, but I would say they're generally not like super great practice, but they're good enough practice for some aspects. Like you can get your mechanics down, you can get your stab management down, you can learn how to live better, but there's definitely a lot of things that you cannot learn in the live OPR that you could learn in a war environment, and that barrier to entry is still very, very high, which is just going to make it so that that alt problem is kind of emphasized. People who do not know about the startup missed the event. There were some people that I know of that had like mental problems that were going on at the start of the event and like generally like deleted Discord for like a solid like 2 weeks, and they completely missed the sign up. There's people that had like all kinds of IRL issues. There were people that were like deployed and got back from deployment and they missed that startup. It's like it felt like it kind of got dropped in the water like with a less than a week's notice, and feels like there were a large amount of people that kind of missed the event off of that. It also feels like if you weren't super connected in the kind of Twitch streamer, YouTuber community, that you would have missed it. Like by the time I realized that the event signups were happening, like I put a video out and they were closed within like the next 2 days or something like that. It was something like a 2 or 3 day window where you could sign up for the event, which is just way too short for an event of this magnitude, in my opinion. I don't think it could really be changed in hindsight, but that's something that needs to be changed for future events if there are going to be future events. There's no replacements allowed for people that corresponded to draft picks, if that makes sense. So taking us for an example, our number 3 and number 4 draft pick have basically quit the event for reasons I'll get into later, but we're not allowed to get people that did not sign up for the event originally, that missed that original window. So where this is why this feels unfair to our company as a whole is because we're being offered like round 99, round like 100 draft picks basically for uh players that we got at round 3 and round 4, which you can argue is a fault of drafting those players, but I would argue that given the circumstances of those players, it doesn't necessarily make sense. One of those players had their build manually banned by admins, which I'm gonna talk about later and why that's just a bad idea altogether because it compromises competitive integrity. But that being said, that like that player's build being banned and that player being somewhat of an OTP at that build basically makes it so that player cannot play the event entirety. So that's just kind of rough from our perspective. Soft quitting is tolerated, so I think those players that did soft quit from this event, which generally are more win rider oriented players, aka players who have not lost in New World in like months to years and haven't necessarily had to put any effort to get better, should be blacklisted from the event in the future. That being said, like blacklisting shouldn't be something that's kind of like super commonplace, but there are some people who have generally kind of thrown the event for certain companies. Like there are players that, like I believe Apple's have drafted early to basically quit immediately after they lost their first war, and like stuff like that cannot be tolerated. Those players need to just be blacklisted immediately, and they can't be playing in future events again, in my opinion. The mass and so that's something that kind of needs to be fixed in the future. Some bad actors signed up for the event, but they can make every war and it proceeded to only make one war, missing the majority of wars. So this kind of sabotages their spot. It feels like those players that did that, like we're kind of just saying like, hey, I wonder where I'll get drafted. Like how good do other people think I really am? And that kind of behavior is making it so that people are like kind of losing faith in some of the people that were signed up. Like from our company perspective, I think the company that we drafted on paper is a very good draft. In reality, that it has performed a lot worse than expected because other companies focused on drafting for synergy, and instead of building players up, kind of took a live company and focused on making that live-oriented company better, which is a strategy in its own, but it feels kind of disingenuous with the how the event is supposed to be handled, I guess. Like the event seemed like an event that was sort of pug heavy. Like you would have like a core of people from certain rosters, and then everything else would be players that are kind of brought into the community, kind of taught to be better, rather than kind of being gate kept by friends and then rotating those final slots in and out from people that were not in that original friend group. So that's something I think that could be improved in the future, but isn't necessarily like super terrible for the event as a whole because it was definitely a strategy that was available for the draft, but I don't think it's like super fair to the majority of community-wide players. There's 40 gigabyte updates to 60 gigabyte updates that seem to be pushed right before wars fairly frequently instead of being pushed before the wars to this client, which are resulting in wars being rescheduled and the event's timeline being changed pretty frequently, which is something from the AGS side that probably needs to be improved for future events. It is very frustrating to deal with because there's some people who make plans for the event, like don't go out like Friday night if they have like a war at like 9 or 10 o'clock or whatever, or Saturday night, and they instead end up not doing anything that day. And that could be kind of frustrating for those players. All right, now getting into the spice, the kind of ugly stuff about the event that's happened, either behind the scenes or in front of the scenes that some people haven't really necessarily talked about. Invigorated punishment has caused way too much drama for this event. The core of this bug is that the PvP rewards were changed, but they were changed in a way that made it so that getting these mods was much trickier than it was in the past. These mods also got moved to bind on equip instead of bind on pickup kind of thing. So it's like or not necessarily bind on equip, but you get the idea where you can trade them, and that's something that hasn't really helped too much with this at all. But basically, people are having to get to literal hundreds, like 300 to 400 PvP track just to get access to 2 or 3 of these mods to try to roll for a ring. And it's basically resulted in people just not having this perk for wars, and there's like somewhat of a gear gap inherent to people that have spent the time to actually get those invigorated punishment mods by just leveling up track after track after track and just hoping to get one of them. That is kind of making it so that the experience feels a lot worse than it does at times. Admins are playing God from like an outsider perspective, and I don't think this is generally fair to the community. There's admins that are manually banning builds from the event that AGS has not, when I find this to be like something that completely compromises competitive integrity that should never be tolerated from a PvP perspective. For example, Musket got banned from OPR, so people couldn't practice Musket, but Musket is something that is slotted in EU wars, and there's something where it's like players were grouping up in like 3 to 5 stacks in OPR and playing Musket, kind of ruining the experience for others. But at that point, you just address that problem, right? You have it so that there's a rule where people can't queue with more than like 2 to 3 players in OPRs, which got communicated later. But instead, at the time, muskets were just completely banned, so people that wanted to try musket were not able to. That kind of slot was not able to be adequately practiced on these servers. Instead, people had to practice them on live servers, which was not as good at the time. And by the time this was fixed, the OPR queues are basically dead on this server because the live server queue times are much lower. For reference, the OPR queues on this server right now are between 20 and 30 minutes unless you get in that back-to-back queue, and the live server queues are about 0 to 10 seconds for me generally playing those on the East server with cross-world OPRs. There are also like builds like BB Warhammer that have been completely banned from the event due to bad actors macroing the builds, and there's other people who don't macro the builds who are also to blame for that event. That's why we drafted Pickuck so early, because we knew that he did not macro the build, but it was a build that we figured would do very well in the event. And because that build was completely banned altogether, it was frustrating for Pickuck because he did not a super flexible player. We basically lost out on our number 4 draft pick due to admin rules that were added post event draft that would have, if those rules were added pre-event draft, I don't think it would have been as bad. It would have been awful for Perkuk because he probably would not have been drafted, or at least not been drafted till like round 20, maybe round 25 instead of a top 5 pick. But that generally feels like that player needs to be able to have an adequate replacement for them, and it feels really bad for those players that have had builds or have stuff like that happen to them. It feels like it's a generally like community-wide event, but there's also like kind of a blacklist aspect that the admins are kind of playing with, and there's definitely players that have been completely blacklisted from the event, which makes it feel like it's not a necessarily a community-wide event in my opinion, but it's a event for friends of the community, if that makes sense. Like you have to be in good standing with the actual admins to get into this event, or even be considered, and that I don't find to be super genuine with the terms of community-wide event. That being said, I've seen like worse things for other games, so I don't think this is terrible, but it's like uh kind of annoying to have to tell people that like, hey, you can't play at this event because this admin doesn't like you, and I'm sorry. And that's just kind of annoying to have to deal with. The best company in the event so far with Guangzhou Goats is like actually a live company uh, that was live before the event and drafted those live players for the event. It kind of goes to show that the actual synergy between members matters a lot more than the kind of gameplay aspect itself. That being said, I think that company has improved a lot, but that entire strategy of kind of drafting your friends and kind of building up from that seems to be the best way to win these events, to be honest. You even if you take like a tier 3, tier 4 live company and you bring it to this event, they're going to generally do well just because those players have played together for so long and there's synergy there and the trust that's built up. that cannot be easily replicated in the short amount of time that the event takes. I don't think there's really anything that can really be done about this, but it's like it's not in the spirit of the event to take a live company and make that live company better. It's more so in the spirit of the event to draft people from kind of random companies that seem to have like good VODs or have the potential to be good and try to build them up and get them to work together well. Non-NA regions are banned from playing, but can still be involved with leadership. It feels like there's a double standard with this too. There's also an aspect where streamers were kind of forced to, or they're allowed to be played over other people, and at a certain point, like round 98, round uh 96, like literally just streamers were picked because there was a rule that those streamers had to be picked per AGS, but that's something that cannot really be navigated around for the event admins, but isn't super fair to members of the community. And some of those people that signed up for streamers, to be honest, aren't really streamers. Like there's people that will just stream the wars, and that's like it's like you're a streamer, but you're not really a member of the community if you just stream wars, if that makes sense. Like people just want to see your point of view, and that's about it. Versus like people that kind of queue OPR all day are more involved, like post stuff to like YouTube or kind of generally give back to the community more. Those people, like I think that exception makes sense, but that line wasn't drawn, and it feels like some people snuck into the event just because they were streamers and generally should not be part of this event, even though because they're not like real streamers, if that makes sense at all. Uh, that's kind of a double standard thing that's like harder to take into consideration. There's also the aspect of like there are people from EU that were not able to play in this event because they were not actively part of the NA community, and from that standpoint, they were blacklisted, which I think is like fair because it allows newer people to get into the event. But it feels like there's a double standard of sorts where there's some people who play that are from EU that are playing in the event because they were part of the NA community at some point in time, and there's others that are more involved with that, and it feels like to a degree there's double standard, and that's something I don't think I could really get into without name dropping names, which I don't exactly want to do on this stream. So it's like generally something that's like kind of not great. I think there's also a problem which cannot necessarily be solved, but there's people who aren't used to winning who are winning in the event, and those people you could see their true colors, I guess. Like by that I mean there's companies that have never won in New World before, and those people who are finally getting access to win, instead of like taking it in stride and being like, hey, that was a good war, guys, like good job, like they're or like maybe having some banter back and forth, like that they're kind of getting personal with some of the attacks on players who sometimes are also admins but not necessarily, and that kind of aspect in my opinion is a bannable offense slash it's like something that shouldn't really be super tolerated. If someone can be TOS'd for being like for saying like a gamer word or something like that, someone should be able to be TOS because they had a personal attack on a player. Like I don't think that's like a generally a line that should have to be discussed, but apparently it does have to be discussed because there are some players who are generally being dicks to uh, people have put in a lot of time and effort to try to improve companies. I'm not really talking about myself here, but the people that have been like kind of dickish to me. Like I think it's like kind of fair because I talk shit, and like that's like something that kind of comes with that. But there's other people who are just like literally just putting in time trying to make people better, who are also getting kind of degraded, and I don't think that is very fair to those people at all. And that's just like generally some people are just assholes and are not great people apparently. And I did not really realize that before this event, but I guess that's something that you realize when when those people who were not winning this entire time are starting to win. For the people that were like winning before, it feels like that's not as big of an issue. Like people in dropouts and supple who are dicks, like generally aren't dicks to like newer players. Like it's more of like a banter aspect, versus people who are newer to that. It definitely seems to be like more of a pattern with that itself. There's a kind of a branch problem, I believe, with this version of New World, that it's not stable at all, and that's compromising the competitive integrity of the event. By that, what I mean is there's some people who literally cannot play the event after they were drafted because they realize that their PC cannot handle New World on this patch, but could handle it on the patch before, and that's been very sad and frustrating to deal with. For example, our shot caller Aeonic, like his first war, he crashed. He was never able to get back in. His second war, his PC crashed again. He was able to get back in, but his entire game was black and white. We'd have no idea what happened. And then he had like one more war after that. That wasn't like a that was the first war that were like a real war, and that didn't go well either. Like he was not able to like consistently play the game. And at that point, we're like, hey, we're gonna have to put in another player, another shot caller, because this guy literally cannot play the game, and it kind of compromised how we structured our draft to a degree. And that's something that I feel really bad about, and I don't know what could really be done. It's just a optimization standpoint, and it affects every player from a New World perspective, but it just feels awful that that is happening on this build, and it's also happening on the live build, where people are literally gatekept by the PC that they have. Even the potato graphics stuff doesn't seem to necessarily help with this, and there's something that is just unstable about this current patch that needs to be addressed rather quickly, and especially coming season 3, which as many people have like kind of said is like kind of the make or break it for New World again. It feels like everyone says that every single season, but season 3 with the perk restructuring feels like it's sort of the tipping point, where some people could get back into the game. There's people who have generally left the game. They're waiting for that season to come out to get back into the game so that they're not gatekept by gear as much. It's sort of like a soft reset that you would see in other MMOs, and that it needs to be kind of looked at as well. I would say this patch in general is very, 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 very far from being like an esport ready event. But that's something that's kind of unique to New World, and I would say that esports is like in heavy, heavy, heavy quotes, because there's no way an MMO would ever become an esport by the definition of an MMO. But it's like it's generally kind of sad because the gameplay is like really, really good, but it's not a stable build to be run on any PC. Like if I could run like Valorant or Overwatch or BattleBit or whatever games that you want to like talk about that are like meta right now, like Diablo 4 at like 144 frames, and then I could play New World at 40 to 50 frames on the lowest settings possible, like something is generally wrong there. And that's been kind of known, but it's something that like needs to be addressed, and I'm not sure why that can't be addressed in parallel with features of the game, but and like you work on the past stuff and try to optimize the past stuff while you push out new content, but that's something that like needs to be looked at for sure. The way that draft keys are handed out is like kind of the definition of who knows who for the post event stuff. And even the draft itself, like there are some companies that definitely went off of odds, but there are other companies who just purely drafted friends, and that was not super fair. That being said, it's kind of the nature of an event like this and was kind of expected. But it feels bad for the people that were handed keys out after the event, because it was generally like you needed a admin or a player that was involved with the event in terms of leadership to vouch for that player in order to get them a key, instead of it being like kind of a public forum like it was promised. And because of that aspect, it made it very, very frustrating for a lot of people who did not get drafted because they wanted to be part of the community. They were gate kept by this, and it makes it so that this event isn't necessarily community driven. The other aspect is this keys probably should have just not been promised in the first place, to be honest. But they were, and because they were, there's that expectation that it's going to be handed out fairly, and it just was not. In terms of like where we go from here, I think this event in general is probably the best event that's been done. If you look at the actual other events which had big streamers come to the game, I think it also like they came to the game, but they were tasked with doing PvE oriented events that like generally made them want to immediately quit the game, and were not like they were just like kind of terrible, not fun events. Like, oh, like go skin like 80 boars or something like that as like your event thing. It's like that's definitely what I want to be doing with my free time here. It's like no, that's something that like not everyone wants to be doing, and those big streamers generally did not want to be doing. And I think even though those numbers were probably bigger at the time, it also made it so that those kind of streamers went sour on their opinion of New World, because that was kind of like a disingenuous event at that point. Nothing that can really be done about that right now, but this event I think is generally in the right direction, in the sense that it allows more people to be involved with the PTR, in a way that makes it more encouraging to touch, rather than just looking at PTR and being like, hey, these are the things I need to make money off of next patch because these things are going to be popular in the next meta or whatever. And that's what most people choose the PTR as, instead of as kind of a play with the new aspects, see if there's actually any bugs, and report those bugs to AGS if they're found. So that's something that could be improved. Season 2 for New World League, there's like a potential that could happen for like kind of pre-season 3 hype that would be kind of interesting. I'm not really sure if that's going to happen or not at this point. Like nothing is really promised, nothing is kind of TBD. But I will say that if it does not happen, that season three like really needs to be polished and up to notch because it feels like a lot of people are waiting for that season to come out to like test the waters again. And if that does not go well, that's probably the last straw for New World for a lot of people, to be honest, and people are just going to look towards other games that are coming out that are a little bit more popular. In terms of other things too, like New World League companies, I think are going to become companies on the live servers to a degree. I just don't know exactly on what server, but at least some of those people from the New World League companies are going to end up still playing together on other companies, which I think is a generally good thing. And this VOD-based approach to slotting being better than friend groups showing in results from matches is like I think generally kind of promoting uh, better habits where people slots are more off of merit rather than off of who you know, which I think is always better for a community like this. That being said, let me know what you guys think of this event. This is a longer video, kind of a rant at this point, but I think it's generally a good event for the community and it's overall positive, but that there are a lot of things about it that need to be heavily fixed if there's going to be another one of these in the future. There are lessons that could be learned and kind of changed even for the current event to make it better. And I'll see you guys in the next video.